I will say that we were excited about planning the entire day of this meeting, but I will say that this next segment was one that everyone, hopefully including the panelists, have been looking forward to for quite a while. As all of you know, election administration and election policy really isn't just the purview of election officials anymore. Election policy across the country and here in Sacramento is front and center. So we wanted to bring together some of the policymakers who are most notable in this field to have a discussion about what's working and what's not in California and what their views are for the state going forward. To moderate and lead this session, we have John Myers of ABC News 10. John and I have encountered each other many times throughout the years. I think it's important to have someone like John here. One of the things in my work in the field of election administration is I'm trying to get folks to understand that members of the media in many ways are as important as members of the election community as traditional members of the community, because they are in many ways the leading or only source for information about the election process. So having people of the quality of John Myers in the business focusing on this topic and especially taking time to be with us today is a real treat, hopefully for him as well. So with that, I will hand over the wireless mic and let him take it away. John?
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me here. I appreciate it. So now we come to the fun part of your event where we get to talk politics and how all of the ideas that you have on improving access to elections and encouraging people to vote meets headfirst into all of these people who work in the dark arts of politics. Thank God they do, because it keeps me employed. I kind of felt like, I told Kathy when I was invited to do this, and again, I'm really appreciative of all of you of having me to be a part of this. I told Kathy when we were talking about doing this that maybe I should, if you're in a room full of people who care about elections, you should open with some kind of joke about HAVA or VPAT or anyway. These two DRE engineers were walking into a bar. Anyway, sorry. This is what happens when you're walking across from the Capitol and you start thinking of silly things to say. But I want to introduce the panel here and then just kind of throw it open to them to talk about, the goal of your entire event, of the future of California elections, but try to dig down into some of their own particular ideas, what they see from their vantage points on the campaign trail or in the state capitol or in their communities, frankly. And then in a little bit through this thing, we'll encourage all of you to ask your own questions. There'll be note cards. We'll collect them. I'll sort through them and try to have a lightning round of our guests here. Let me tell you who is on the panel briefly. We are, I think, well represented by different parts of the state and different kinds of ideas on what's going on. Most closely to me, two members of the legislature from the Southern California area, Assemblyman Brian Jones from the San Diego region, and State Senator Alex Padilla from the Los Angeles region. Shawnda Wesley, who's the executive director of the California Democratic Party, who kind of sees everything, and State Senator Leland from San Francisco. And all of them have various interests in elections and election reforms, on committees. Some of them might be running for offices regarding elections. Sorry, I've been reading your campaign filing statements, and so, there was a silence there. They will not go on the record. It's the smile. But I thought I would start broadly because I think it's worth kind of just getting you to fill in the blank in part of this about how you see the current state of elections in California, the election system, the election process, and of course outreach to the public. And that is, we've just come through an election year. 2012, a very big year, pretty good turnout. We always would want more turnout. A lot of people engaged on different issues. And so here we are in 2013 where everybody's supposed to breathe a sigh of relief and elections are over, we'll wait till 2014. And yet that kind of misses what elections officials and experts know they do, which is these are always busy years. And so I want to look, in terms of the year to come and kind of where we are at this point, I want to, if you could talk a little bit, each of you, about your own particular priorities on the issue of election reforms, expanding access of the public and getting people engaged. What did we learn from the election year that has just come? And what do we take from that into 2014? Just a general sense of where you're sitting at this vantage point. Do you want them to pick up the mics, or are they just going to talk and it'll pick them up? There you go. So here, look.
You want me to go first?
There it is. Sure, I'm going to go right down the row with the Assemblyman Jones.
Well, we have a lot to still figure out from 2012 regarding the online registration, and then if same-day registration is going to go into place, how that'll affect elections. So we've got to do that analysis and then move forward from there. Obviously, my priorities in 2014 are going to be to grow my caucus, just like everybody else's priorities are going to be to grow their caucus. So we've got a lot of work to do on my side of the aisle as a Republican to figure out, our message and, how do we communicate that to small business owners? How do we communicate that to moms and dads and, people working for a living at their dining room table and communicate the message of lower taxes, a more responsive government, and appeal to them to support what I think we have ideas in common. We just have dropped the ball on messaging it.
That's sort of bringing more people to the polls in some way, too.
Exactly, yeah. But I think my personal priority in bringing people to the polls is I want informed voters to come to the polls and vote. I was amazed on the day after the election how many people came up to me and said, "Did you know Prop 30 is retroactive on the personal income tax portion of it?" And I said, "Absolutely, I knew that. That's why I was arguing against it." I believe a lot of people went to the polls in November to vote for Prop 30 that didn't recognize that it was retroactive to January 1st of 2012 on their personal income tax. And that was a message that we dropped the ball in communicating because we didn't effectively communicate that.
Senator Padilla, from your vantage point, I'm curious what you're looking at this year, and I should have referenced this too. I mean, when I've looked at the initial drop of bills at the Capitol, I'm intrigued by how many are election related, about the rules of elections, about it's a fascinating thing. Again, it's not an off year. I mean, maybe in this the sense here is that we're talking about legislation that will be in place for the next election cycle in 2014. But how do you approach the year to come in terms of what we've learned from the election that we just went through?
So I think a couple of things. So we are just coming off of presidential election year, and it's not just a coverage of what assembly district are you in, what congressional district are you in, but from the presidential contest across the country and everywhere in between. Every 4 years we kind of revisit. How's our democracy functioning? And we know generically, we all believe things like, well, the strength of our democracy is based on how many people are participating. Okay, kind of broad, kind of a value statement. Both Republicans and Democrats can agree on that. But in practice, what's happening? I can tell you most people will feel generally good about the turnout here in California and what it was this last November. But if you factor in just a different way of looking at it or measuring it, if you will, how many people, not just how many people voted versus how many registered voters did not participate in November, but how many people are eligible to register to vote that haven't registered, and in that bigger universe, what was the turnout percentage or sample? I know Naleo's in the audience. I'm the president of Naleo in my spare time. We also track other numbers like how many legal residents are eligible to become citizens and registered to vote and participate, but haven't done so. So it's kind of like these concentric circles of people who either are participating, aren't participating, or eligible to participate but aren't participating, and asking our questions, so what are the barriers? What's holding people back? So I think from a broad civic engagement conversation, there's a lot of questions to be asked there, and we're all exploring the ideas of how can we make it easy for people to register to vote if they're not registered, and then to actually cast their ballot, whether it's at the polling place and not have to wait an hour, as the president referenced on election night and in his his inaugural address, or voting by mail. I'll be honest, one of the things that concerns me about voting by mail, and it's been pretty a glamorous initiative to take on in recent years, is we're having a vote by mail push by political parties or certain elected officials, and at the same time, Congress is looking at slashing the budget for the U.S. Postal Service. So how do those two trends kind of reconcile? But I personally get my juices going because this is how I got my start. Years before I ever even ran for office, I was a campaign volunteer and then a campaign manager, and it wasn't a particular issue that really got me motivated to get involved in government and politics. It was a friend of mine was running for office. He was an underdog candidate, And we just went to good old-fashioned community organizing, and it was those early experiences of getting people who weren't registered to register, people who hadn't voted to vote for the first time, and really increase the pool of people participating that was sort of the beginning of my involvement.
When we look at the dynamics of the election that just went through 2012, Shawnda Wesley, you would probably ought to see it as a different way than the Assemblyman did, based on party preference and kind of what happened in your particular things that you're focused on. But I'm curious from your vantage point to try to kind of focus in on something here in this opening round, and then we'll kind of throw it open to everyone. What did you see most interestingly from your vantage point out of the 2012 elections in terms of who the voters were and the voter outreach and getting people? You spent a lot of time with ground efforts and bringing people out and mobilizing voters who believed in the issues the way your party believes in them. What did you see as the most notable part of that 2012 experience?
Well, definitely it was, oh wait, before I start, I wanted to say something
You've
about...
got a voting joke too.
No. I wish I did. I just wanted to commend the planners of this conference. Many, many times there are conferences, panels, that have exclusively male participants, and you guys have done an amazing job at doing a 50-50 split without any kind of cajoling from some of the feminists in the area, and I just want to thank you so much for recognizing that. Or maybe it's the nature of the work. There's more women doing the hard work, but anyway.
We are not going to be tweeted on this one, are we? I've seen that tweet fight. Yes.
Yes. I might have participated. So having said that, so in 2012, I think the one thing that a lot of folks overlooked about our great results that we had in 2012 was the great coordination between working families in the party and other community groups. For one of the first times ever, the party and labor were able to coordinate everything, because there's no campaign finance rules prohibiting that, to help defeat Prop 32 and to pass Prop 30. And because we were all working off the same voter file, going after the same voters, we were able to minimize our financial and volunteer resource spill. So I know we contacted a lot more people. We did 1.7 million Knoxer dials in our volunteer effort alone. Labor did a lot more than that. They had some paid program too. And then we also worked closely with the DCCC, and they did a massive amount of phone calls and door knocking. One of the things, though, that I know everyone talks about it, and it's true, there was many more communities of color voting, younger people voting. When we found out very late in the game about the ridiculous number of people who signed up online to vote, we were able to reach out to them immediately with phone banks and a slate card mailer, and we have this election protection hotline. Our phone calls went through the roof as soon as that slate card landed, knowing that these folks intended to vote, they had questions, and we were there to answer it for them. One thing, though, that I know a lot of folks came out of this election and said, wow, the Democrats just are really ruling the roost, we did an amazing job, but as a Democrat, I actually think we can do a lot better, and that's by correcting the Los Angeles problem. Senator kind of mentioned the vote-by-mail issue, and yes, the cuts to the postal office, the USPS is very important to look at and find a solution to. But if you look at the turnout for Los Angeles County overall, right now with the raw numbers, it's about 64%. But then if you look at just the subset of the permanent vote by mail, it's 76%. Now the problem for Democrats statewide, thanks to a Republican blogger who wrote about this and made us think about it in 2011, the problem with turnout is that Los Angeles County has the lowest percentage of permanent vote-by-mail voters in the state. So we have the largest base voting the least. So we went out in 2011 to prepare for 2012 by signing up 50,000 Los Angeles County residents who are occasional Democratic voters to vote by mail. And I want to also commend Dean Logan, who I know is here, who's done an amazing job at outreach to get folks engaged in voting by mail. And there's been a huge change since he's become the registrar there. But that's 50,000. And those 50,000 actually turned out at 79%, we're finding out when we did a voter match yesterday. So the program works, but there's hundreds of thousands of Los Angeles County residents who this could affect and make a huge difference for Democrats statewide, especially on the issue ballot elections, like the cancer thing that just lost by 24,000 votes. Those are the types of things that we need to go after next, so we're not quite finished.
So let me, Senator Yee, you were obviously very involved in the online registration process, and clearly there was a lot of success out of that. Is that good enough as it is? I'm sure you're going to tell me no, in which case you can tell me how should we make it better. But clearly a lot of Californians took advantage of that. It's hard to not call that a success where it is, but where does that lead to? Where do we take that beyond that website that exists now?
Well, I think clearly November was a good year. It was a good election, good month for all of us who are Democrats. We now are able to say that we have a supermajority on both sides of the houses. I think one of the things that I was particularly pleased with was the online voter registration bill that I had. We had nearly 800,000, about 780,000 new voters who had not registered before. And then about 1 million individuals used the online voting process or voter registration process to either update their data, change party affiliations, and so on. So it was a pretty powerful tool. But I think one of the things that we've got to do is to kind of look broadly and see what happened in other states. And what's happening in other states do, in fact, affect California. Let me just give you a couple examples. We were monitoring what was going on in Florida. We were monitoring in Ohio and Arizona. And literally, they were, in those states, setting up a poll tax. And I'll go back a little bit about that. It is a new form of a poll tax. There were voter suppression in those states, and that strategy was spilled into California. I spent about a week or two before the election and went down to San Diego. And literally, there were individuals who were deathly afraid of voting because they were afraid that they were going to be intimidated, that they were going to put a tremendous hardship on them voting. And so those are the things that we still need to kind of watch out for. It is a poll tax when you have extensive lines. If you think about an hourly worker having to wait in line to vote 2-3 hours, that is about $50 to $60 to $100 that you're going to lose not working but standing in a line to vote. That is a poll tax in all intent and result of exactly having individuals pay to vote. And so those are things that we've got to watch out for. Voter intimidation, I think we need to think about. I think the other thing that we've got to also watch out for are these sort of stealth organizations that came from Arizona to try influence, our election. Outside money from other jurisdictions coming into California to influence and that's one of the reasons why we're talking about, well, what we're going to do about it. I've got legislation that says that you've got to open your books. You cannot hide behind a nonprofit to influence our election. I think the other thing that we've got to do is to help individuals understand that you have a civic responsibility to participate in that democratic process by voting, by registering to vote. And so we have a bill that basically, for all the state agency website, that it leads you to a message about the importance of voting. And we've got to do better in voter civic engagement. Those are extremely important strategies that we've got to somehow start moving ahead if we are going to increase, as I think Shawnda said, let's do even more. And as Senator Padilla says, there's still so many other individuals that are not registered to vote, or they are registered but they don't vote. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done, but what we've got to do is to ensure that those outside forces that's trying to determine our election results, that we do everything that we can to make sure that that does not happen.
Let me ask a question of all of you, and now just kind of jump in whenever you want to jump in. There's so many different things that we could talk about, but one thing that often gets discussed, and I think there's some difference of opinion here, and I kind of like to get you guys to think about it. Sometimes when I think about what we often talk about in elections, there's this bit of a continuum between access and security. And I'm not saying that necessarily they have to be separate, but there are some people and proposals that go towards access. There are some that want to talk more about security. And I want to talk about where you all see that debate as we move into 2013 and 2014. And if they are not separate, if there is a way to have 100% access and 100% security, I think all of these guys would like to know what it is. But what do we do with that debate? That's where the debate often comes down. We often get into this, you know, you want to have more people, but who do you know who they are? And on and on and on and on. Where are we in that long struggle of those two issues?
Well, I don't think access and security are mutually exclusive. Okay. I mean, I think, let me translate it for you from in my own words. You know, leading up to the November election, we heard about, as Senator Yee mentioned, Ohio, Florida, Wisconsin, other states, over the course of the last year, their legislatures and governors adopting new laws, or at least attempting to, in my mind, make it more difficult to register to vote or to actually cast your ballot. And it was, for the most part, behind the message of voter fraud. Yet, statistically, you know, it's minimal, if not more minimal, the actual number of cases you can point to of voter fraud. So I think once you look at the data behind it, it kind of speaks for itself. So you have to what's happening in the real world, not just what's the rhetoric, but also starting with the United States Constitution and fundamentally people's right to vote, the federal and state law that allows people to vote without having to show an ID when they show up at the polls. You know, we have the laws that are in place, and it's about making sure we're vigilant and enforcing the current laws, not making it stricter, because I think fundamentally our democracy is relatively open and accessible. It's just not always convenient. But, you know, and as society has changed, you know, maybe not voting specifically, but just sort of state government or city government services in general, most of us, if we have a problem with our credit card, there's a number on the back that we can call 24 hours a day and try to resolve an issue. If you have a problem with your, you know, something at Macy's, you can maybe go online and change the shipping address, or, you know, if you bought something online. But when it comes to interfacing with your government, boy, we're kind of old-fashioned.
But let me interrupt if I might, because Assemblyman, let me get you in this, because I don't want to, well, I'm going to play right into kind of where the conventional wisdom of this would go about the security issue. A lot of the security issues of the Senators' Summit were passed in states with Republican legislators and Republican governors. Do you see the security issue differently than the senator does? Is there a...
Well, first of all,
others, of course.
Right. You know, first of all, I want every U.S. citizen to vote that wants to vote. You know, voting in America is not a...
But you wanted educated voters to vote too, as you said.
My preference would be educated voters that know what they're voting for. You know,
which is my job too.
I think that, exactly. Well, it's your job as the media, but it's also our job as elected officials and people involved with the various parties to communicate. You know, we have to have an education element of our communications as well. You know, Senator Padilla talked about statistics. Well, in those states that specifically passed voter ID laws so that they would know who's voting, and that the people that are voting are U.S. citizens and legal to vote and are only voting once. In those states, you know, the argument to not pass voter ID is disenfranchisement of certain community groups. Well, there's no statistic in recent years that shows that in those states where these ID laws have been passed, that those community groups that we're concerned about have been disenfranchised. In fact, we can point to statistics in some of these states where these community groups, their participation rate increases with voter ID rather than decreases. So, you know, you have to prove who you are almost every day of life, just to transact through a business day. If you want to go buy cold remedy at your local pharmacy, you have to show who you are. You have to give them an ID of who you are. If you want to cash a check at a bank, you have to show them who you are. There's multiple examples of having to prove who you are to transact throughout a business day. Now, the argument is going to be, Senator Yee may go back to a poll tax. Well, there's ways that you can provide people with an identification that they don't have to pay a fee to do that, to prove who they are.
Well, but let me just, and I'm sure I can feel the debate coming, which I don't want to stop it, but I do want to inject two things. One, the cards, by the way, write your questions on them because we're going to come back to you in a moment. But the other reality is, as some people in this room will ask, and I will ask too, why don't we just have everybody automatically register to vote who's an American citizen? I mean, why do you have to register? Why can't I just show up on my 18th birthday and there I'm in the system? Is there a downside? And then we'll jump on the security issue. But is there a downside to that? Well,
I think it as long as you can prove that you're a U.S. citizen when you're voting, like I said, I'm for access to every U.S. citizen. We just have to have a method in place. Look, we're a nation of immigrants, and some immigrants become U.S. citizens and some don't. So we got to have U.S. citizens voting because those are people that have a stake. Well, we all have a stake in our government and our future, but our Constitution is set up that U.S. citizens can vote.
Let me let some of you guys jump into it. I'm sorry.
Well, I'm going to definitely have to disagree with you, Assemblyman, because I think that there's a couple different types of fraud, and everyone wants to talk about voter fraud. There are more people who get struck by lightning and killed than commit voter fraud in the nation. In Indiana, they passed a voter ID law which successfully stopped 10 nuns who were in their 80s and 90s from voting. Way to go. In Florida, they passed an ID law, and you're more likely to get attacked by a shark than commit voter fraud in Florida. In Texas, you're more likely to, they have more sightings, of UFOs and Bigfoot than they do voter fraud, but they passed an ID law. This has nothing to do with fraud. The fraud that exists is something that the Republican Party has been perpetrating in the state of California now for years.
I think we're going to have a different debate here if we go down that road.
Let me add a couple of things. So separate from Bigfoot and UFO and shark attacks, here's the reality. In Florida, there was more legitimate United States citizens thrown off the voter rolls because of the laws that were attempted than actual voter fraud incidents, right? So let's talk statistics. If we look at the laws that were passed and signed into
that's a
the law
different
that
issue
were
than ID,
stayed
though.
by the
that's
courts,
not an ID issue.
it was because of compliance or lack thereof with the Federal Voting Rights Act.
Here's the
different
issue.
than getting on a plane, which is another example of when you have to maybe show ID, and casting the right to vote is the ability to the right to vote is embedded in the United States Constitution.
We will not do voter fraud on the entire panel. I mean, I don't want to spend the whole time on this.
The other issue is in the Assemblyman's own backyard, is what I'm saying.
Okay.
Instead of voter fraud, people showing up and illegally voting, let's talk about people who are signing folks up to register to vote and to get their signatures on ballot props. Because in 2006, 2008, 2010, and 2012, there's been verified voter fraud of companies that have been hired by Republicans, either locally or state, in numerous counties, many of them in the Inland Empire, which touches the Assemblyman's district.
So
why
here's
don't
how we
we
can
look
shift.
at that?
Regardless of what happened in other states, California can be the counterexample of how to do things better.
Let me step back from the partisan allegation part. I hear you, and I did a piece on voter registration fraud allegations in Sacramento County this past fall. But I don't want to make it about what party's doing what bad. I want to ask a different question though, because and that is, let me use the example in Sacramento County. It was a particular case, and it was a particular story, and there was cards that looked a little wacky, and some of you are sitting out here now in the audience. But here's my question. That case gets referred to the California Secretary of State, who has fraud investigators, of which they have almost none, from what I can tell, and it takes forever to get an answer on this. So where is the funding to root out allegations of fraud, to answer them definitively or not? And I asked the elected officials up here, Shawnda, sorry, more than you, but there seems to be a very difficult time to get funding for the process of elections, whether it's fraud, whether it is equipment, the database we haven't even gotten to. Hey, everybody's favorite thing. But where, why is it so difficult to get traction? All of you are elected officials who run in elections, and then the issue of elections kind of goes by the wayside. Obviously, we've had big issues in California. But why is it so difficult to get that? I mean, whether it is more investigators or other equipment or whatever.
I think it's a combination of things. I mean, not that everything is the result of the budget problems and woes that we've had over the last 4 or 5 years, but the ability to expand the resources in the Secretary of State's office in recent years, at least partially, is due to that. So as the economy begins to turn around more, Prop 30 has stabilized things for a while. That's one of the areas that we'll consider and look at. But even without additional investigators or without bigger budgets, we can certainly be operating more effectively and efficiently with the resources that we do have. One of the themes, if you look at my track record across policy areas, how do we utilize technology to sort of make things better? Whether it's transportation, whether it's the electricity grid, why not our voter registration and voting systems? Starting with the voter registration. Compatible databases. Whoa, what a concept. Coordination between the state and county elections officials. That should have been done already.
And yet there are some who are very fearful of the technology. And I don't have to go very far back to talk about that we are here in 2013 voting on paper ballots. We walked away kind of individually as counties and kind of collectively as a state from electronic voting machines a few years ago. This is a different end of the security issue, accessibility issue. I mean, Senator, you would jump in.
Sure. I think we do have to give due respect to the Secretary of State. I mean, she runs the department. I would imagine that she articulates her needs and so on. There are times when we do step in. When the issue of Cal Access, the database that sort of defines or identifies who gets what money, where the money is being spent by politicians, corporations and donors and so on.
It's also called How I Spend My Weekends During Election Season.
That's exactly right. Well, the legislature worked together to increase lobbying fee to fund that particular project. So I think that we all will find ways to ensure the integrity of our election process. I want to get back to that earlier point you raised about access and security. You're absolutely right. We've got to find ways to deal with those two issues. I think as Senator Padilla said, they're not mutually exclusive. They have to be together. You cannot have access and not have some security as to whether or not, in fact, these are individuals that ought to register to vote. And so we've got to do that. But one of the things that happens quite a bit in this particular area is that whenever we talk about access, whenever we talk about security, there's all kinds of arguments raised and the conversation stops. And we can't do that anymore. And the reason why we can't do that is that we've got to look at technology and we've got to look at other ways of increasing voter participation. Online voter registration was a tremendous lesson for all of us. People said young people they're not interested. Well, guess what? We found a technology that they felt pretty comfortable at, and all kinds of individuals, young age, started to register to vote. And then through Shawnda and other efforts, they actually went and voted. And I think that seniors can also utilize that particular technology to get involved. It's just that, I don't know, for whatever reason, we didn't sort of market that particular strategy to that particular population, but we should and we can. So we've got to use technology to increase voter participation. And after all, I'm an immigrant, and I think that we've got to get everyone to participate in that democratic process. Their voice is going to make better policy because their voice will then include their perspective in what that public policy for the state of California.
It's interesting that you talk about one way that I wanted to pivot, and again, reminder, if you've got the cards and you have questions, we're going to collect them soon, and I'll start going through those, and they'll ask the really tough questions. But I want to pivot the idea of the online registration, which was a statewide process. And I'm struck by that in one way, which is that we don't have a statewide election system. These people know better than anyone. We have 58 separate county election systems, and you could multiply that across the United States. Is there any benefit? Should we be talking about some broader uniformity in the way we conduct elections, either across California or somewhere else? I mean, should we? Because it is easy if I am in Humboldt or Stanislaus County or Imperial County to go to that website and register. But once I start getting into exactly how I vote, what I do, where I go, the system that I use, I find myself in a different scenario based on what part of California I live in. And again, we're not immune. I mean, the rest of the country deals with this as well. But should we have a more uniform system? Is there any reason not to? Is there a danger in it? I mean, is there...
Well, my understanding, regarding uniformity, all the counties operate under the same laws, passed by the legislature. Really, in the online registration was statewide. The only differences, from my understanding, is how the county administers the election process. But they still have to all follow the same laws, rules, and regulations.
Ballots don't look the same.
Well, the
where your
voting
vote is
right.
different.
The voting machines might be different. The ballot might be a little bit different. I don't know if that's a debate we've had, and I don't know if I come down on one side or the other. I think we've got other issues that we're debating before that. So,
I think I bring it up just simply because when you look at the state, when you step back and look at an election that way, I'm always marveled by how different the process plays out. And is that anything we need to think of? Senator,
Right. So uniformity, conformity. I think we're on a spectrum of a dialogue there that different people have different comfort levels. How uniform versus centralized you're talking about. Let me give you an example of. And then one of the proposals that we'll be introducing next week. Right before Election Day, Hurricane Sandy hits the East Coast, and we all were kind of proud of SMUD and PG&E and Southern California Edison Sempra when some of the utility workers from California went back east to help in the recovery. Well, a lot of them hadn't applied to vote by mail in advance, and so they were unable to vote because they were back east. And we had built-in a mechanism in the event of an emergency to be able to cast a ballot otherwise. Within the state of California, the governor does have, under declaration of emergencies, a way to work with local election officials, because what if there's an earthquake in Southern California? You have Bay Area folks down there helping to be able to cast their vote, and then we figure it out. You all know this much better than I. So why not accommodate the law for out-of-state incidents? I think that's kind of common sense, and what can be more important than preserving people's ability to cast their ballot? So if we already have segments of being able to, cast your vote maybe in a different precinct provisionally or in a different county in the event of an emergency, there's all little pieces of some level of conformity that's already in existence, and it's a matter of building upon that. Building upon that, if it's consistent with making participation more accessible, maintaining security, and heaven forbid, run our systems more cost effectively.
Go ahead, Senator. You guys got a lot of questions.
Sure. One of the realities is that elections are, in fact, local activities. There are some jurisdictions that are by charter, established by charter, so they have a little bit more leeway. I think that what is important is to be respectful of some of the individuality within different local communities, working with the chief election official of different counties and helping to coordinate where you can. But I think one of the things that we ought to really work hard on at the state level is to have a common database. VoCal is something that we've been talking about, and it has not happened yet.
Forever.
Sorry.
As a reporter,
and that's extremely, extremely important. Someone who is from in Redding, going and moving down to San Diego, should be able to go there and register to vote and have no problems whatsoever about, are you registered already, are you not registered, or whether or not you're eligible or not. So I think that that's one large project that the chief election officer for the state of California ought to be working on. And then the other issues, you've got to individualize. There are some issues that are particularly important in urban areas that may not be as important as rural areas, north and south, all of those different permutations. But I think that one of the things that we've got to do is to deal with this whole issue of VoCal, a statewide common database.
How we talked about this, and some of the cards, I've already started shuffling through them, so keep send in your ideas, and of course I won't get 40 in by the time of the end, but I'll synthesize some of these. But several of you are raising a point. I've raised it, but I'm going to try to put a finer point on it. And it's about money, and it's about funding, and it's about funding. County budgets are strapped as they are. Whether it is statewide, whether it's a special election here, there, everywhere. We've already got some now scheduled as members have moved from office to office that counties have to bear the burden, or it is another particular proposal about how to do something that the counties have to spend the money for. And they don't have the money, and that's what I have heard from elections officials all over the state in all the years that I've covered elections. What do we do about that? I mean, what does that say about that? And I've asked you that a little bit before. You know, we've talked about it, but how do you guarantee folks on the local level that, yeah, you hear it, you're not going to give them something else to do without the money to do it? Because there's a lot of skepticism out there.
Well, since Prop 25 went into place and the majority party gets to approve the budget, that question would be more appropriate to our two members of the majority party.
Well, we sure are glad that folks passed Prop 30 so we could start talking about those other things.
Well, and on that note, on Prop 30, you know, I don't know if you all pay attention to the San Diego, the San Diego news, but Phil Mickelson, who is a very successful, high-income earner, is announced because of Prop 30, he's moving out of state. To avoid those income taxes.
Let me redirect.
Sure, you
back
can flip
to it.
another Republican to replace.
How do I get back to my point? How do we deal with the local
point on it.
Right? How do we deal with the local state issues? How do we deal with unfunded mandates? How do we
look from a budget standpoint? And by the way, Prop 25 says 2/3 vote, not 21 Democrats in the Senate. So Republicans are welcome to vote for the budget too. It's a combination of fighting for additional resources, absolutely, but also being as efficient with the resources that we do have. I mean, by and large, our voter registration system is paper-based today. Now we have online registration. I think that's a good start. But to the extent that we can get paperless, for example, or partially paperless, that's more efficient and less costly from a staff perspective, then we're getting more out of our taxpayer dollar. That's just sort of one example. These, every registrar recorder that I've talked to gets these waves of registration cards right before the deadline, before every election. If somehow we're able to smooth out that curve, then you can maybe better balance out the staffing up versus staffing down needs over the course of time too. I mean, there's a lot of things to really be looking at here. The modernization of voter registration doesn't end with online registration. We know that there's the databases that need to be talking to each other, both within government and even outside of government, to confirm people's address and spelling of the name, and make sure that the John Doe here that registers is the John Doe that is who we think it is. So the utilization of technology, I think, is going to present a lot of opportunity while steering clear of the controversies and the fears of how the ballots are counted.
Let me ask you a bit of a lightning round question, and I'm going to take liberties with this question that asked about this applying to particular cities in California, but let me branch it out to there. There are a number of ideas, some of them have been used and they're debated as to their efficiency, about changing the election system in terms of instant runoff voting, in terms of, any of you support that or oppose that? What's your opinion on instant runoff voting? And they go silent.
I'm not a fan. I'll just tell you.
Well, you've had some experience in San Francisco with that particular part. I was trying not to go with that anyway. But
San Francisco has.
Do you like it?
Instant runoff.
Do you like it?
It's a system that has tremendous benefits. I think number one, it does in fact cause every individual in San Francisco to attend to a November election. When you have these kinds of runoffs in December, there's tremendous drop-off. I think that the difficulty with instant runoff is that many individuals still are just getting used to understanding how to vote without instant runoff. And having a robust educational program to educate individuals and help them understand what instant runoff is all about is extremely, extremely important. So for me, I think instant runoff has worked. It has saved quite a bit of money. It has brought a lot more participation in this particular arena of instant runoff and elections, and so I think it's fine.
Do you think the voters understand it?
Well, that's part of the problem. I think what happened in San Francisco is that government officials fail to really help everyone truly understand what instant runoff is all about and how you go about calculating and understanding how you finally select the winner of a particular race. And so this goes to the heart of a lot of the election activities, not only in local communities, but in the state, that we don't do enough to kind of help people understand why you ought to vote and how do you vote. When you don't make it easy and comfortable and something that is familiar, people are not going to participate. And so the responsibility for all of us is not to just simply on election day, have the polls there and have that staff. And so it's about doing all the preparatory works prior to the election and prior to getting people to the polls as to why it is important to go to the polls and what this is all about.
Most of the people that I've met with over the years that have pushed the ranked choice or instant runoff voting, whatever you want to call it, have argued for it for one of two reasons. One is, well, we get the results quicker. The other is, well, we avoid having to have a second round of voting, a general or runoff, whatever you want to call it. I think both are off base. For one, whether it's one Democrat or Republican or the top two vote getters, or even in nonpartisan races, when I first ran for city council, I was in a runoff with the other top vote getter. Once you're down to two candidates, I think that secondary campaign period where voters get a chance to compare side by side and make a final selection on who they're going to vote for, I think has tremendous value, and it's worth maybe waiting a couple more weeks to find out the ultimate results, or if it costs us a little bit more. I think there's not I'd rather spend that money versus compromise that little chunk of democracy that will get through the confusion or the while maybe legal and ethical in some people's eyes, not in others, the collusion among candidates of, well, give me the first choice, but if your second choice had to be so-and-so, as long as it's not so-and-so. And I think that gets real messy, and we've seen the results of that in the first couple of experiments.
I agree 100% with Senator Padilla.
See, Republicans
right,
and Democrats can't agree on something.
We can. And in addition to that,
Let's just end it right there.
in addition to what Senator Padilla said, when you talk about disenfranchisement of the voters, to me, this instant runoff system, which I'd never heard it called that, so I was confused. The ranking system, the more confusing you make a voting system, the more voters you're going to disenfranchise. And I hadn't even heard about this system till I got elected up here 2 years ago, and then started hearing about the different municipalities that are using it. And I think it just disenfranchises voters and it keeps them from voting. So in addition to what Senator Padilla said.
When we talk about voters and what they understand and voter education, Shawnda, let me direct this at you first, and then we'll kind of blow it out. So you spend a lot of time, you and everyone that you work with spend a lot of time walking neighborhoods, knocking on doors, asking are they registered, registering people to vote, all kinds of processes. Do you think people get it? Do you think they understand? Is there a level, are there things they don't understand about voting or registering or their responsibilities or the way elections work? I mean, we get a lot of questions, and some of these I want to hit a couple things in particular in a moment about voter education and civic, and do we need to teach it more in schools? I mean, what do we need to do? But what do you see on the ground when you go into communities that people get or don't get? Because to me, this gets at the heart of the issue of why people don't vote, which we're not so much going there quite yet. But what do you see in terms of people, what they understand or don't understand?
You got to think, for us, we're going to those occasional Democrats. We're going to the ones who don't always turn out. And so we get some of the most basic questions. And it really does inhibit them from exercising their right. Like, I just moved. I'm just going to go down to this polling place down here. And then you have to explain to them, well, if you haven't re-registered, then you're going to need to vote provisionally. And if you vote provisionally, this is what happens. And their heads start to kind of spin around, and they get a little nervous about going in there if it's not something that they always do. And so there is definitely confusion out there. It's one of the reasons why, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but we pushed the permanent vote by mail. When we initially did the program, we we did this whole Obama thing. They didn't care. What they cared about was that they could vote at home with their families, take their time, not feel rushed, not have to stand in line. And those types, when we register voters now, we don't ever just register them. We also sign them up to vote by mail and explain how they get to vote with their family. They can take 3 weeks to vote. And
As long as they turn the ballot in on time.
as long as turn the ballot in time. And that seems to help them get a greater comfort with the idea of voting if it's not something that they generally do.
So some of what you're seeing then is people who it's not like they don't understand how to vote, but the mechanics of what happens in life when you're trying to navigate the rest of everything. That's what I mean. And that gets to me to the issue of voter education, people understanding, like there's a proposal in one of the cards references, I'm glad they did because I would have tried to remember it. There's a piece of legislation introduced to let 15-year-olds pre-register to vote, kind of putting them in the chute, so to speak. I'm thinking of bull riding, I guess they're next. But is that the kind of thing we need to be looking at? Do we need to be getting kids at that age or younger, or do we need, I mean, what, you know, because again, I am scratching back to the fundamental question of why some people vote, why they don't. The voter, is it apathy? Is it just not interested? I mean, is it not understanding? I mean, what do you think about those ideas of memorializing, I guess, this, you know, pathway to voting?
I think it's everybody's responsibility. I mean, I believe it's Senator Jackson that introduced that bill. And so we'll see when it comes to committee, and I guess I'd be inclined to support it, but interested in, you know, I'm sure it's not that simple. Nothing is ever that simple in implementation. But I think the broader question you're asking is, so many people aren't participating either because they're not registered, or they are registered and not turning out. Whose fault is it? Whose responsibility is it? Is it government officials, as Senator Yee has mentioned, that we need to do a better job of promoting the elections and the clarity on here's how in your county or in your precinct the ballot looks and what to do? Is it the political party's responsibility? Is it the responsibility of candidates when they're up for election or re-election? Is it just a neighborly thing to do? You know, reaching across the across the fence or across the street and saying, hey, don't forget to vote today. Or are you a parent like so many that I've been doing this now? My 5-year-old goes to the polling place with me, and he gets a sticker because they let him kind of just scribble on a piece of paper and get into the habit of, hey, it's election day, this is our responsibility here. I think it's a collective responsibility to educate. There's no secret when election day is. I mean, between the amount of mail and the amount of television advertising, everybody knows when election day is coming. But the actual effort to get to the polling place or voting by mail, and hopefully additional types of opportunities to cast your ballot in the future, we're all in it together.
A couple of questions have come in on one particular topic under the headline of disenfranchisement of voters. And it has gone on, as this one person well says it, let me just read off the card. A looming problem with missing members of the electorate, men and women currently and formerly incarcerated. And acknowledgement of the disparities there in the criminal justice system. But should California give these people a right to vote, access to vote? There's issues as well that were brought up about under the realignment in California where some people are ineligible to vote who are sitting in county jails. What can we do to that part of the electorate? We've talked about how we treat people behind bars in the last legislative session for terms of counting districts and redistricting. But what in terms of counting their votes? Do we have an option here? Should we be doing more?
Well, I can tell you, I'm certainly willing to have that discussion because, it's hard for me to say somebody is prohibited from voting for the rest of their life. So part of that debate and that discussion is when do you allow them to start, at what point in time do they earn the right to vote again? I'm assuming by that question you mean felons that have been convicted and released from prison and...
I think the question is broad enough that you can put your own parameters on it, where you think there is expanded, that we should expand access, and where you wouldn't.
Right, and I think that's a discussion that we should have to kind of, work those out to see, where we can make those changes.
Here's something that's sort of ironic. Everyone here, and I'm sure everyone in government and all the individuals in the audience, want people to participate. But we do everything to prevent people from participating. Well, you're too young, you shouldn't register to vote. Well, you're incarcerated, so you shouldn't do. We ought to make it available, easily available for individual to be registered and actually then to vote. If that is a fundamental goal of our society, to have them to participate, then we ought to make it easy for them. And the reason why you want to make it easy for them is that as soon as they are registered to vote, then they are comfortable and familiar about that particular process. And then hopefully they understand that that's part of their obligation. If you are going to be a citizen of the United States, that's your obligation. And so when you are familiar and you understand that obligation, you then execute that particular set of behavior. So I think that we ought to look at ways to help younger individuals be prepared, and they ought to then, if we're looking at 15 or 14 or whatever, and you ought to then pre-register them. And then those individuals that are of age, we should find a way to just have them all be registered to vote. That is what we ought to do, to help people to find ways to make it easier for them, not harder. You can deal with all the security issues and all that, but we've got to make it easier and not more difficult. Because if you want them to participate, then don't put all those barriers. If you put those barriers, then people are going to then shy away from that particular activity.
I think this is one of the unexpected examples of how maybe every county is a little different, or every local jurisdiction. And I say that because of this. I mean, maybe there's Marin, and I come from LA County, kind of two different populations. The couple of campaigns that I managed before I ran for office, and even in my own first race for city council, this was actually part of our volunteer training. You know, here's your list of voters, and if the voter says, yes, I'm voting for so-and-so, here's a Y, and, you know, circle the LS for a lawn sign, you know, but one of the anticipated questions is not just where does he stand on this, where does he stand on that, but, well, my son just got out of prison. Can he vote? And when you're training your campaign volunteers, the distinction between, well, is he on parole or is he on probation? That community is vested in the answer to that question. So sometimes it's organic in the campaign process, as well as just referring people to a website to find the answer to that question.
I just want to take issue with one of the things that Senator Yee said. You know, we want people to vote, but then we do everything we can to put up barriers to keep them from voting. Well, I don't agree with that statement. I don't believe that as elected officials and as registrars in California that we're putting up barriers for the purpose of keeping people from voting. Now, we're putting up marks of responsibility as a U.S. citizen to vote, and we want the right. We want legal U.S. citizens voting. But this concept that we have to make it so convenient that there's no cost to us to go to the poll 1 day or 2 days every 2 years to vote is offensive to me. The right to vote in America was bought and paid for with blood, sweat, and tears of the veterans of this country that have fought for our liberty and freedom. And we have countries across the world now fighting for that same right of democracy. And you look at the pictures coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan of those countries that have finally released themselves of the tyranny of a dictatorship and have earned the right and fought for the right to go to the polls to vote under real circumstances of intimidation. You know, the original polls when they opened in Iraq, intimidation meant you were going to get shot for going to go vote in some of the neighborhoods. So this whole concept that in America we have to make it so convenient and so these people fought for their right in these other countries.
What's the downside of the convenience, though, someone? Let me ask you, what's the downside of the convenience?
They dipped their finger in ink to prove that they voted.
Right. But
they were proud of that.
I want to get to a question rather than just your point's well taken, but what's the downside of the convenience, if I could?
We can make it convenient, but when that's our primary concern about making it so convenient that there's no cost to go vote, that's the part that I'm offended about. If I have to wait an hour in line to go vote for my elected representatives, I'll wait an hour to go vote for my elected representatives so that I know my voice is being heard in that voting place. Waiting an hour is not going to keep me from voting. Now, I don't know how many places in California that actually happens, that you have to wait an hour to go vote. I vote at the polling place every year. I don't do vote by mail. I support it, but I prefer to vote by mail. And every time I go in there, I may be there 15 minutes. And in San Diego County, I can't think of one instance where somebody had to wait an hour to go vote. But even if you did have to wait an hour.
I was an hour 45 in 2008.
Okay,
Here in Sacramento.
all right. Okay, that's fine, and I appreciate that. But that's a right that we have in America to vote. There's countries that don't have that right, and they would love to have it, and they would wait all day to vote if they could. So there's nothing wrong with making it convenient, but I guess my issue is that ought not be our primary motivating goal in voting.
You know, the truth is, and I think it's something that we don't actually say out loud very often, but Republicans vote, Democrats have a hard time getting to the polls. So that's our job. So the party and other folks who are in the progressive community try to encourage those folks to vote. And the way we do that is we find their name on a voter roll, and it has a D after it. So when Republican vendors switch those people to Republicans without their knowledge, it takes them out of our get out the vote process, thereby disenfranchising them and making it less likely they're going to vote and causing an impediment. And that's my concern, that issue has to be addressed at some point.
Let me ask a different question. All of you who have everyone.
Let me just address
Sure.
because she's brought it up twice now or 3 times. That vendor that you keep referring to was dealt with by the elections team in our party. So yes, it did happen. Yes, it was unfortunate, but we dealt with it. We fired him and moved on to another vendor. That happens on both sides of you hire the same vendors we hire. The vendors are not partisan, and so it happens on both sides of the aisle. So I just wanted to make that clarification.
That's actually not true. There's 5 vendors, and one of them, John Burkett, in 2006, was brought up on charges. They hired him again in 2010 and again in 2012.
And let me pivot to something different. The 4 folks who are on the stage with me all have a partisan affiliation. I do not have a partisan affiliation. Not so much because I'm a reporter, because I think both of your parties are kind of wacky sometimes.
I think we do too.
That's true.
That's occupational hazard of covering the Capitol. But what I wanted to say is that a lot of this outreach to voters, to registering people to vote, happens through parties. Right. Democrats go and do their people. You said yourself, you're looking for Democrats. Republicans, you're looking for Republicans. What about the rest of us? And so what I get to is what can we do that is not based on the 2 major parties to get people to register to vote, engagement? Because I know Shawnda's getting D's, and I know the Assemblyman's getting R's, and I'm sitting back there and I'm wondering if anybody comes to my door because I don't have either one of those on any of the stuff. And you look at me and go, I'm not getting that guy. Unless you think I'm persuadable.
We're good with the DTSs because they actually affiliate.
We're NPPs now.
Oh, I'm sorry, NPPs, because you all affiliate on issues with the Democrats. We'll sign you up any day of the week.
I think there's some that affiliate that way, but fair. But the point is, what do we do to because a lot of things that happen through the election process happen through the political parties.
Well,
and third parties have problems with the major parties. But the point is, what do we do outside? Is there anything we can do?
The best answer to your question is the parties are motivated to register people. We have a vested interest in each of us getting more voters. So that's why the parties do that. Now, I'll admit, Shawnda's team's done a little bit better job than my team's done recently, but we're going to fix that. So, but until there's it costs money to register voters. The parties can raise money. Until there's a third organization or fourth organization that comes around to register voters, and it's a free country. They're welcome to do it. They just haven't organized to do it.
It costs money, though, too, and that goes back to whether there's money through government sources versus party sources.
But I think the fact or the statement that most people are register to vote through one of the two political parties, I'll even throw in the candidates by extension, I think is an overly broad generalization.
If I said most, I should have said a lot. I'll qualify.
Right. Or, I mean, my experience was this. My high school government teacher is the one that shoved the voter registration card in front of me when he knew I turned 18. Well, I'm not on behalf of any party, but does that happen 20% of the time, 2% of the time? There's other ways to do that. Parents registering their kids, or neighbor to neighbor, whatever the thing may be. I think the more fundamental question, and it's going to be a longer-term strategy, is how do we fundamentally shift the voter registration experience from being one that requires an affirmative action on behalf of the citizen to register to vote versus one, I think there's a difference between, making it as convenient as possible versus not making it as inconvenient as necessary for people to be, automatically pre-registered, or some of those sorts of things that make it easy to take that leap to be able to participate. I think that's a more fundamental and longer term question. I think in that spirit, take a moment to thank all of you who are participating in the SB 35 implementation process. My bill from last year that builds on Motor Voter, so it's not just while you're getting your driver's license and checking that box, you're taking that extra step to register to vote while you're already giving your name, address, date of birth, and signing something. But for the people who will be coming through a state office or agency somehow to register for health benefits under the Healthcare Reform Act, if they're putting down their name, address, date of birth, et cetera, and they're a U.S. citizen, register to vote in that process. It's part of making it as convenient as possible, not as less inconvenient as necessary.
Quick question, Senator. Do you have any concerns at all about that? Because Motor Voter does not have the greatest record of accuracy. And there have been news stories by colleagues of mine where DMV and it doesn't quite work out. Do you have any concerns? Is that,
I think where the inaccuracy comes in part has been education, in part has been coordination between the proper agencies, and that's going to continue, and that'll apply here as well. So no, I'm not concerned.
Lightning round question, if I could. Yeah, I'm just looking. Yeah, online voting. Will we ever get there? Do you want to get there? Should we just stop talking about it? But hey, it's on a card.
Since it's lightning round and assumes a quick answer, I'll say no, I don't support online voting.
Why is that?
Security issues, mainly.
But now I bank online. I pay my taxes online. Is that? And this is
and
what
you have to
people
prove
will say.
who you and you have to prove who you are online. So without voter identification, I couldn't support online voting.
Okay. Anyone else? Anyone for it?
We should definitely talk about it. My concern is that those lower economic areas where folks don't always have, I know it's hard for us to believe, but don't have access to the internet.
Well, and it's not just low income, it's rural versus
and rural,
urban.
yeah,
exactly.
There you go. So those are some concerns that automatically pop into my head, is making sure not to disenfranchise folks.
I would agree that we ought to talk about it, and we ought not to stop the conversation.
You come from probably the most wired city in the country.
But I think that we have to ensure the security, the validity, the reliability of all that information before we take that giant step. I just believe that if it's going to happen, it's got to happen in California. We might as well start the conversation, begin the conversation, continue the conversation here in California, because we have the best minds here in terms of innovation and figuring out how do we deal with all the different challenges is going to be absolutely, absolutely critical.
Let me ask all of you about voting machines briefly. This is something, as I've already referenced it once before with my lame attempt at humor, but spending several years through that process as we went post-HAVA with counties that went to DREs, and then we decertified the DREs, and now we're back in a system where they really have kind of gone away, and counties through some of their money and through federal money, spent large amounts of money on machines that were stored away and never to be used again. Is there a future for the return of touchscreen machines, electronic machines? And if there's a future, how would we get there? I mean, some of you, as I said, some of you are eyeing positions that you may have a place to discuss that in some future job. But what do we do about that? Is there a place for that? Is there a future?
I think there's certainly a future for it, but it's a matter of voter confidence, and can that process regain the confidence of the voters to trust it? And that's up to the elected officials that want to use that system and the the people that are making them.
It seemed to me when I would go out, and I'm not saying that my anecdotes are indicative of the whole state, that the most confidence issues were raised by elected officials, and not so much by voters. And I'm not saying there aren't voters, but as elected officials, pardon me, Shawnda, a little jumping over. Do you see a role for those machines?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the conversation, the debate on electronic voting machines is over yet. As technology gets more sophisticated, is there a way? I mean, I can see that in the future, but I also want to thank the folks at the Caltech MIT Voting Project that have made it clear in my mind, is there a way to utilize technology on how a ballot is produced versus how a vote is cast? I think that's not an insignificant distinction. And again, utilizing technology at the various segments, whether it's registration, whether it's voter information, education, ballot creation even, versus vote casting and vote counting, I think there's still a lot of progress to be made, efficiency to be gained, enfranchisement to be improved with technology.
I think the issue of the touchscreen is exactly the problem that we have right now in terms of online voting. There are issues that were raised with the touchscreen, and all of a sudden the conversation just simply stopped. The issue with the touchscreen was, where's the paper trail? It seemed to me that what should have happened is the conversation should have continued to then figure out that particular issue and close that particular loop. I think that we've got to look at different technology because we've got to understand that the voting public is changing. The sensibility and the sensitivity that we have to the diversity of that voting population is also becoming a lot more heightened. And so I believe that the way in which to address a lot of the concerns of the diversity of the voting public and the variety of different needs within that voting public can in fact be addressed by looking at technology. But again, you've got to then figure out, well, how do you ensure the integrity and the reliability of that particular vote? And that is ultimately the question that we all have to ask, regardless of what that technology eventually is going to be.
I think one of the barriers we're going to try to lift this year is this restriction on publicly owned voting machines. I mean, again, you all know this much better than I, but you have the standards you need.
You mean open source software?
In your voting equipment, and today your only option is to see which vendor can meet those specs. Dean Logan in LA County is leading the effort to try to create a publicly owned system that'll meet all the criteria necessary for a county as diverse and complex as Los Angeles, if not the state of California. We should be able to pursue that, not as a mandate, but as an option.
Let me ask another quick question about the process of elections briefly, and then I want to get to some other issues. But we're sitting here talking about voting machines. I also want to talk, and this is from Senator Yee's comments about that the voters are changing. Things which one of the trends that we have seen in this state, particularly, are people who are registered to vote by mail. And Shawnda, you talked about people who want to vote with their families, and yet there continues to be hesitancy in some corners from either parties or elected officials about vote by mail, about more counties that could vote only by mail. We only have very small counties in California that have these. The special elections, couldn't they be vote by mail instead of having to roll out poll workers and spend money? And then we kind of get back to the security issue. I mean, as people have pointed out to me, if you're worried about who the voter is, do you really know who mailed the vote in? So I get, the voters seem to be voting, voting, pun intended, they seem to be voting with their pens. A lot of them, we've seen phenomenal numbers of vote by mail, and yet there always feels to be some kind of hesitancy from the powers that be. I don't know how I define that about it. I mean, versus poll voting and other. Can we do more for vote by mail? Should we do more for vote by mail? I mean, should we change the system somehow to obviously line it more up with where the voters are going? There are more and more of them than ever before.
Well, I think the objection to going to 100% vote by mail is not necessarily just from elected officials. I know in my district, the voters wouldn't stand for that. And I'm in a district that is half rural, half urban, so some of my rural areas, they do only vote by mail. But I think you run into some constitutionality issues too, when the Constitution says you will have a voting day if you go to 100% voting by mail.
You realize, I know some of you do, that there is, that some people on the local level are frustrated. They feel that Sacramento will not let them do vote by mail things. As one card says, why is it so difficult for the legislature to pass a bill to allow county boards of supervisors to authorize, special elections or vacancy elections by mail? Is there a hesitancy to allow people to do more of this?
I don't have an issue with vote by mail. I think it's a fine option for those who choose it, either on a permanent or one-time or case-by-case basis. I do have a problem with vote by mail only. I'm for expanding opportunities to participate, not restricting or even substituting opportunities to participate.
But yet at the same time, Shawnda, you found people who want to vote by mail more. So,
yeah.
And that was their choice, and that's great.
And the turnout is just so much higher. So, I mean, it's something that I'm definitely personally interested in, whether or not that would work in California. I think the two things that I would want to see addressed is postage, because, and then that's going to be a huge cost to the state, right? But hopefully not to the county. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the counties will worry about their cost, but yes.
That's not necessarily what I was implying, but but in order to make it fair for folks who don't want to fish around for a stamp, or have other things they want to spend their money on than a stamp, or if it's more than just one postage stamp, would your average voter know to put X number of stamps on it, and then it never gets there? And then the other thing is something we were talking about earlier today, and that is allowing a longer period to receive those ballots, as long as they were postmarked by election day. How long do you let them still come in to make it a little bit more fair? But I think that's still a conversation, actually, even in our own party, whether or not going fully vote by mail is what we want. I mean, a lot of advocates for it in our party. And then there are some that are hesitant because of the communities that it could affect.
And historically, Democrats have voted more at the polling place than by mail. And maybe that, again, drawing too broad a point.
But the population's changing. That's what we thought we would see in the field when we tried to sign folks up, but we really didn't.
Which is your LA County experience.
I think, like everything, something that seems rather simple is extremely complex. A lot of people like vote by mail. Why not go to it? There are certain individuals within our population that find it more important to have a secret ballot. If you're a disabled individual, going to a polling place and being there by yourself, you are assured the privacy of that particular vote. Oftentimes, you may have attendants or other individuals at your place, and therefore, your vote may not necessarily be private. And we guarantee that your vote is, in fact, private. And so I think that increasing vote by mail, I represent San Mateo County. There's a lot of interest in doing vote by mail only. But I think we've also got to look at the diversity of our population. It's not just language, and it's just not age. It's also about disability. And how do you ensure that the disabled community also have the ability and the right to a private, personal vote, and not something that someone's going to look over your shoulder or see how you're going to vote and so on at that particular dinner table.
If I might say, though, Senator, that same group of Californians, disabled Californians, were the most unhappy when I talked to them about the decertification of DREs. More disabled Californians, they would argue, had better access to vote by themselves at those machines. And so it brings that question back up.
And the sadness of it is that because of the concern that was raised, by other individuals, that discussion just stopped. And again, I just implore that, as these issues move forward, we've got to look at the diversity of our communities in California and figure out, how do we accommodate, everyone so that they do have a private, personal vote just for themselves.
I want to ask a question about diversity here before I pivot into it. And thank you for your cards. And I apologize to some of you. I won't get every single question. What's that? Last question? Oh, look at that. I've run out of time. And of all people to run out of time, the television guy says wrap. Well, let me ask a short one then. Let me just try to squeeze just a very tiny other one in there because I just got to gin them up just a little bit more. But the diversity question comes up in the cards. And the diversity question is, the diversity of California is being measured in so many ways as the changes in California, the population, the demographics. And the electorate has not historically caught up with that. I mean, maybe we have seen changes in 2012, but the electorate has not quite matched up to the demography of California. Is there anything that you see from your vantage points that you can do? And I'm asking you again to be brief. If I could shove in my last question, what do you envision that you could do to try to match those two groups of people up better? Who Californians are compared to who the Californians that vote are?
Well, I think that's a function of America. I mean, that's been going on since the founding of the country. We're a nation of immigrants. And so when you have for example, in my district, I have the second largest Chaldean community outside of Detroit, or outside of Iraq. So Iraq, Detroit, Michigan, and then San Diego, East County, California. So, it takes some time as these folks immigrate to become citizens and then start voting. So, I think that's just, part of it's natural. There's a natural lag between the immigration and the voting. And then part of it, I think what we've all been arguing today, is outreach and education and communication.
Do you have yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'd agree that I think part of it is a function of just that natural lag that is going to exist. Our job, our challenge is how do we reduce the time that lag takes effect. In part, it could be, citizenship, and registration, then participation. Some of it, frankly, is just age. The statistic from the last census, 51% of Californians under the age of 18 are Latino. Right, we know how fast the Asian community is growing statewide. Is that going to be reflected in the voter rolls next cycle? Probably not. We know that come 20 years from now, we'll have moved significantly in that direction. So, how do we minimize that lag from enfranchising potential voters at the ages of 18, 19, 20, not, 29, 30, 31, when they have maybe different motivations for registering or not registering, and pushing the citizenship for those who are eligible and voter registration for those who are citizens, further along, I think will create a voter pool that's more reflective of California demographically. I think another element that will be part of the actual enfranchisement and participation is language. I know in the LA Unified School District alone, there's more than 130 languages spoken. So all those letters to parents that go home, they got to get translated by law or by policy or both. Yet we only have a handful of languages protected under the Voting Rights Act. I had a bill last year that would have translated petitions, initiative petitions, right, the ballot and summary, because as significant policy decisions are being made in the state of California, like Prop 30, but so many others, at the ballot box, not all voters are able to participate equally in determining what gets on the ballot or what doesn't get on the ballot. So there's other challenges along those lines too.
And brevity, yes, please, go ahead.
One thing that the state party did is we had a program called It Gets Bluer. It was in the Inland Empires because we were targeting those 3 seats that we won in the Inland Empire. But one of the things we did is we took the census data and looked at California voting age population Latinos and then overlaid it by precinct where we had Latinos who were registered, found the disparities, the gaps, and that's where we targeted our volunteer registration efforts in order to hopefully get some of those Latinos who were locally and not, were voting age and not registered to vote for the 2012 election.
I think there's got to be a paradigm shift, a reframing of what is the responsibility of all of us, including the chief election officer for the state of California, in terms of elections. It is not about just simply registering individuals to vote and making sure that they vote. It's really about how you start from the very, very beginning. Why is it important to vote? What is the civic responsibility that we have? And what is it that we do to help young individuals, kids in elementary schools and on and on and on, to kind of urge their parents to get involved? You know, that's a powerful tool. I mean, if you look at recycling, I bet you everybody, you know, all the adults, mom and dads, are recycling because their kids at school were told and they learn how important recycling is. And so I think that's a powerful way in terms of helping all of us understand that we have a responsibility. That, I think, is going to help tremendously increase the voter roll participation from the diversity. And I think that, you know, the election process doesn't end after the votes are counted. There's always a next election. And so what are we doing to kind of help individuals understand an ongoing basis the importance of voting and our civic responsibility and our civic engagement?
I had another question, but that feels like a closer. In which case, and Kathy's very pleased to have heard me say that, and I get the 30-second cue. I do want to thank Leland Yee, Shawnda Wesley, Alex Padilla, Brian Jones, and thank all of you. It's a great conversation.
Thank you all.